In 1590, a single word carved into a tree would become America's oldest unsolved mystery. 117 colonists vanished without a trace. No bodies, no struggle, just one cryptic message left behind. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the lost colony of Roanoke. And the truth is far more disturbing than any legend. In 1587, Governor John White stood on English soil, clutching a promise he desperately wanted to keep. He had just left 117 souls on Roanoke Island, including his daughter Eleanor and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. He promised he'd return with supplies within months. But what John White didn't know was that he was about to be trapped in England for 3 agonizing years. And when he finally returned, he would find something that would haunt him until his dying day. The Spanish Armada changed everything. England went to war, and every ship, including White's, was commandeered for battle. Month after month, White fought desperately to secure passage back to his family. Can you imagine the torment? Every night wondering if your daughter was still alive, if your infant granddaughter had survived her first winter. But the war dragged on, and the ocean between them grew darker with each passing season. When White finally secured a ship in 1590, he had no idea that he was already too late. What he would discover on that August day would echo through 4 centuries. August 18th, 1590. John White's heart must have seized when he saw the shore. The settlement he left bustling with life was now a graveyard of silence. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging off hinges. But there was no sign of attack, no blood, no broken weapons, no graves. It was as if every single person had simply decided to walk away from their lives. White searched frantically, calling out names that were swallowed by the wind. His daughter's name, his granddaughter's, but only silence answered. Then he saw it, carved into a wooden post. 5 letters that would become America's most famous mystery. Croatoan. The word was carved deep, with deliberate force. This wasn't scratched in panic. Someone had taken time to make sure this message would last. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't the only carving White found. On a nearby tree, 3 letters were cut even deeper, CRO. 2 messages. Same word. But why? And here's the detail that changes everything. White had told the colonists before he left that if they were forced to leave, they should carve their destination into a tree. If they were in danger, they should carve a Maltese cross above it. There was no cross above Croatoan. That meant they left willingly, didn't it? So what was Croatoan? It wasn't just a word, it was a place. Croatoan Island, about 50 miles south of Roanoke, was home to the Croatoan tribe. These weren't strangers to the colonists. In fact, Manteo, a Croatoan native who had traveled to England with earlier expeditions, was one of the colonists' most trusted allies. He had been baptized as a Christian and given the title Lord of Roanoke. If the colonists were going anywhere, logically, they would go to Manteo's people. White knew this. He immediately wanted to sail to Croatoan Island. But then, something happened that would seal the mystery for centuries. A storm was coming. His crew refused to make the journey. They forced him back to England. White would never return to America. He would die in 1593, never knowing what happened to his family. But the question remains, why didn't anyone else go to Croatoan to look for them? This is where the story takes its first dark turn. White's crew forced him to abandon the search, citing the approaching storm and dwindling supplies. But historical records suggest something more sinister. The crew might have been more interested in privateering, attacking Spanish ships for profit, than rescuing colonists. White was powerless. Imagine watching the coast of Croatoan Island fade into the distance, knowing your family might be just 50 miles away and being unable to do anything about it. But here's what haunts historians. In the decades that followed, multiple expeditions came to Virginia. The Jamestown colony was established just 17 years later, in 1607. They had the resources, the men, and the motivation to solve the mystery. So why didn't they? The answer involves conspiracy, murder, and a cover-up that went all the way to the top. Enter Captain John Smith. Yes, the Pocahontas fame, who arrived in Jamestown in 1607. Smith was obsessed with finding the lost colonists. And here's the shocking part. He might have actually found them. In his writings, Smith recorded that the powerful chief Powhatan told him a disturbing story. Powhatan claimed that he had ordered the massacre of colonists who were living peacefully with tribes to the south. Smith wrote that Powhatan showed him metal implements and pieces of European clothing as proof. If this is true, then some Roanoke colonists survived for nearly 2 decades, only to be killed just before they could be rescued. But why would Powhatan kill them? And is this story even true, or was it propaganda? The answers are coming, but first, if you're hooked on this mystery like I am, smash that subscribe button. We dive deep into history's darkest unsolved cases, and trust me, this story gets even more twisted. Powhatan's confession, if true, is chilling. He allegedly told Smith that the colonists had integrated with the Chesapeake tribe near modern-day Norfolk. They had built houses, planted crops, and were living peacefully. But Powhatan saw them as a threat. His priests had prophesied that from the Chesapeake Bay, a nation shall arise which will dissolve and give end to his empire. So, according to Smith's account, Powhatan sent warriors to annihilate the settlement. Every man, woman, and child was killed. But here's the problem. There's no archaeological evidence of this massacre. No mass grave has ever been found. Some historians believe Smith fabricated or exaggerated the story to justify English aggression against Powhatan. Others believe the massacre happened, but the evidence was destroyed or remains undiscovered. Either way, this account raises a terrifying question. Were the Roanoke colonists murdered to prevent a prophecy from coming true? For centuries, the Croatoan theory remained just that, a theory. But in the 1990s and 2000s, something extraordinary happened. Archaeologists began finding English artifacts on Hatteras Island, the modern name for Croatoan Island. They discovered a 16th century English signet ring, European copper, and pottery fragments that matched the time period of the lost colony. Then, in 2012, researchers at the British Museum made a stunning discovery while analyzing one of John White's maps using advanced imaging technology. Hidden beneath patches on the map were 2 symbols, a small red and blue fort symbol drawn in an area known as Site X, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke. White had deliberately concealed this location. Why? Was this a backup plan? A secret refuge? What was John White hiding? The hidden symbols on White's map changed everything. When archaeologists excavated Site X, located near the Salmon Creek area, they found European pottery, nails, and other artifacts dating to the late 16th century, exactly when the colonists would have been there. This wasn't a Native American site. English colonists had definitely been there. But here's the mystery that deepens. These artifacts suggest a small group, maybe a dozen people at most. What happened to the other 100 colonists? This discovery supports a theory that historians are now taking seriously. The colony split up. Some went to Croatoan Island with Manteo. Some went inland to Site X. But what about the others? And why did they split? Was it by choice, or were they running from something? The evidence suggests the answer is far more complex and darker than anyone imagined. Let's talk about the most overlooked aspect of this mystery, cultural integration. Recent DNA studies of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina have revealed something extraordinary. The Lumbee have European genetic markers dating back to the late 16th century. They also have English surnames like Dare, Cooper, and Bailey, names that match Roanoke colonists. For generations, The Lumbee have oral histories claiming descent from people who talked in books, their description of English colonists. Here's what this suggests. Many colonists didn't die. They assimilated. They married into native tribes, had children, and their bloodline continues today. But if this is true, why didn't they try to contact other English settlers when Jamestown was established? Were they forbidden? Or had they chosen to leave their English identity behind forever? The answer involves something most historians are afraid to discuss: the Spanish connection. This is the piece of the puzzle that changes everything, yet it's rarely mentioned in mainstream discussions. In 1587, England and Spain were bitter enemies. The Spanish controlled Florida and had a network of missions stretching up the coast. Spanish documents from this period explicitly mention English settlements in Virginia and describe them as threats that must be eliminated. Spanish raiding parties were active in the region. In fact, just 2 years before the Roanoke colony was established, the Spanish had destroyed an English settlement at St. Augustine. Here's the terrifying possibility. The Roanoke colonists knew the Spanish were coming. The word Croatoan wasn't left for John White. It was left as a decoy. They wanted anyone looking, especially Spanish raiders, to think they'd gone to Croatoan Island, when in reality, they'd scattered inland to hide. This explains why the carving was so deliberate, so visible. It was meant to be found, but not by friends. Imagine you're a colonist at Roanoke in 1588. Your governor has been gone for over a year. Your supplies are running dangerously low. Tensions with some local tribes are escalating. And you've just received intelligence, perhaps from Manteo or other friendly natives, that Spanish forces are planning to raid your settlement. What do? You can't defend the fort with your dwindling numbers. You can't wait for help that may never come. Your only option is to disappear. So you plan a coordinated exodus. The strongest families will go inland to establish a hidden settlement. The others will go to Croatoan Island, where Manteo's people can provide food and protection. You carve Croatoan into the post as a false trail. And then, in the cover of darkness, you vanish into the wilderness. This isn't speculation. This is the scenario that forensic historians are now reconstructing based on material evidence, weather patterns, and Spanish military records. But let's return to Croatoan Island, because the evidence there is equally compelling. Remember those English artifacts found on Hatteras? They weren't scattered randomly. They were found in Native American contexts, mixed in with Croatoan tribal sites. This means the English weren't just visiting. They were living among the Croatoan people. Archaeological evidence shows English and native tools being used side by side. European sewing needles were found alongside traditional Croatoan pottery. This wasn't conquest. This was cohabitation. But here's the haunting question. If the colonists integrated peacefully, why did they never send word to England? Ships came to the region. They could have made contact. Unless they couldn't. What if something happened on Croatoan Island that made it impossible for them to leave? What if they became prisoners, not of violence, but of circumstance? The hurricane theory. This is the explanation that makes the most sense climatologically, but is absolutely heartbreaking. Historical weather records indicate that the late 16th century experienced increased hurricane activity along the North Carolina coast. Croatoan Island is a barrier island, extremely vulnerable to storm surge and flooding. If a major hurricane struck after the colonists arrived there, it could have been catastrophic. Entire villages could have been swept away. Any survivors would have been scattered, traumatized, and unable to maintain their English identity. This would explain why no cohesive group was ever found, why artifacts are scattered across such a wide area, and why the colonists never made organized contact with later expeditions. They didn't choose to vanish. Nature made that choice for them. But even this theory has a dark twist that researchers discovered only recently. In 2020, Coastal erosion on Hatteras Island revealed something extraordinary: human remains. The bones were sent for analysis, and the results were stunning. Carbon dating placed them in the late 16th century. Isotope analysis of the teeth suggested a European origin. The remains were found with corroded English buttons and fabric fragments that matched Elizabethan clothing. This was potentially a Roanoke colonist. But here's what's deeply disturbing. The bones showed signs of malnutrition and disease. Whoever this person was, they suffered greatly before they died. The remains also showed evidence of a hasty burial, or possibly no burial at all, simply being covered by sand over time. This suggests that by the time this individual died, social structures had collapsed. There was no community left to perform proper burial rites. The colony hadn't just dispersed. It had disintegrated. But one bone found with these remains would reveal a secret that researchers are still trying to understand. That bone was a child's femur. The size and development indicated a child between 18 months and 3 years old. This child could have been Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter, or one of the other children born at Roanoke. The isotope analysis told a tragic story. This child had experienced severe dietary stress. They had gone from a European diet to a primarily corn-based diet, then to periods of near starvation. This wasn't a quick tragedy. This was slow, agonizing decline over years. The child's bones also showed evidence of disease, possibly typhoid or dysentery. Imagine Eleanor Dare, watching her daughter waste away, unable to help, watching everything English about their existence stripped away, knowing that her father would never come, that England would never send help. This is the human cost of the lost colony that we rarely discuss. These weren't just names in a historical mystery. They were real people who suffered real horrors. The Native American perspective on this mystery has been systematically ignored for centuries, but it holds crucial clues. The Lumbee, Hatteras, and other coastal tribes have oral traditions about the old ones who came from across the water. These stories describe fair-skinned people who lost their way and were taken in by the tribes. But there's a darker thread in these stories too. Some traditions speak of disease brought by the outsiders, of entire villages being wiped out by illnesses the native healers couldn't cure. This is historically consistent. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhoid decimated native populations who had no immunity. If the Roanoke colonists were carrying these diseases, the tribes who took them in may have experienced catastrophic losses. This could explain why the integration was ultimately unsuccessful, why no large community of mixed English and native people was ever found intact. Disease may have killed both groups. Winter 1587 to 1588. This is the period nobody talks about, but it's probably when the colony's fate was sealed. John White left in late 1587, planning to return before winter. He didn't. That means the colonists faced their first winter completely alone, with limited supplies and no reinforcements. Winter on the Outer Banks is brutal, freezing winds, limited food sources, and isolation. Historical records show this particular winter was especially harsh. The colonists would have burned through their supplies quickly. Hunting and fishing would have been nearly impossible. This is when desperation would have set in. This is when the decision to leave Roanoke would have stopped being a choice and become a necessity for survival. Some families probably didn't make it through that first winter. The ones who did would have been weakened, sick, and traumatized. By the time they carved Croatoan, they weren't leaving a message of hope. They were leaving a tombstone. John White spent his final years in Ireland, living with his son. Historical records show he was a broken man, consumed by guilt and grief. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, begging for expeditions to be sent to find his family. No one came. England was embroiled in wars with Spain and had no resources for rescue missions. White died around 1593, never knowing what happened to Eleanor and Virginia. But here's something that will break your heart. In his final known letter, written in 1593, White described a dream he kept having. He dreamed that his granddaughter Virginia was alive, grown up, speaking a language he couldn't understand, but with his daughter's eyes. He wrote that he preferred to believe they were alive and had found a new life, because the alternative, that they had died alone and afraid, was unbearable. In a way, modern research has proven White's dream partially true. Through DNA, through artifacts, through oral histories, Virginia Dare's legacy survived, just not in the way anyone expected. Fast forward to the 21st century. Modern genetic technology has revolutionized the search for Roanoke's descendants. Research teams have been conducting DNA analysis on members of the Lumbee tribe, the Hatteras people, and other eastern North Carolina communities. The results are astonishing. Multiple individuals carry European genetic markers that predate Jamestown. They have haplogroups consistent with English origin from the late 16th century. The genetic signature is real. The colonists' DNA survived. But here's where it gets complicated. Establishing a direct, provable link to specific Roanoke colonists is nearly impossible without comparative DNA from their English relatives, and most of those family lines are extinct or untraceable. So we have proof that English people integrated into native communities before 1607, but we can't definitively say this person is descended from Eleanor Dare or this person is descended from John Smith the colonist. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. However, one DNA sample revealed something that nobody expected. In 2015, a woman from the Lumbee tribe agreed to full genomic sequencing as part of a research project. Her mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to daughter, was traced back through maternal lines. The results suggested European origin in the late 1500s. But the breakthrough came when researchers compared her DNA to historical English databases. They found a potential match to families from Cornwall, England, the same region many Roanoke colonists came from. The statistical probability was strong enough to suggest a real connection. This woman, living in North Carolina in the 21st century, could be a direct descendant of a lost colony survivor. When interviewed, she described feeling an overwhelming connection to the story she'd heard all her life but never fully believed. She said, "All my life, my grandmother told me we came from people who talked in books. I thought it was just a story. Now I know it's real." But her DNA also revealed something unexpected, evidence of Spanish ancestry. How did Spanish DNA get into a Roanoke descendants genetic code? Remember the Spanish threat we discussed earlier? It wasn't theoretical. Spanish documents from the Archive of the Indies in Seville reveal that in 1588, Spanish forces from St. Augustine were specifically ordered to locate and destroy English settlements in Virginia. A Spanish expedition led by Vicente Gonzalez sailed up the coast and reached the Chesapeake Bay area. His mission report, discovered in the 1990s, describes finding signs of English presence, but no colonists. Gonzalez reported burning abandoned structures and leaving markers claiming the land for Spain. But here's the chilling part. His report also mentions taking prisoners from native villages suspected of harboring English refugees. If Spanish forces captured Roanoke colonists, what happened to them? Were they taken to St. Augustine? Were they executed as heretics and spies? Or were they forced into servitude in Spanish Florida? This could explain the Spanish DNA in some descendants. It would also explain why no unified English community was ever found. The Spanish had already destroyed it. But there's another possibility that combines multiple theories into one devastating scenario. What if the colonists successfully made it to Croatoan Island, integrated with Mantio's people, and then attempted to sail to Jamestown when they heard English ships had returned in 1607. Historical weather data shows that 1607 had severe storm activity. Multiple ships were lost. What if the Roanoke survivors loaded onto boats or small ships to reach Jamestown, but were caught in a storm? What if they drowned within sight of rescue? This would explain why Jamestown colonists heard rumors about English survivors, but never found them. This would explain why artifacts are scattered across such a wide geographic area, because wreckage and bodies would have washed up on different shores. This would explain the sudden disappearance of any organized Roanoke community, right when they should have been making contact. They didn't choose to remain hidden. The ocean chose for them. And the cruelest part? They died trying to go home. At Jamestown itself, archaeologists have found clues that support connection to Roanoke survivors. In the early layers of the Jamestown fort, dating to 1607 to 1610, researchers discovered artifacts that don't fit the standard Jamestown inventory. These include older-style English tools, weapons, and personal items consistent with 1580s manufacture, exactly when the Roanoke colonists would have brought them. How did 1580s English artifacts get into a settlement founded in 1607? The most logical explanation: they were brought by Roanoke survivors who made contact with Jamestown colonists. But if that's true, why isn't there any written record of Roanoke survivors at Jamestown? Here's the disturbing answer. There might have been, but it was suppressed. The Virginia Company, which funded Jamestown, had every reason to bury evidence of Roanoke survivors. Why? Because if colonists from Roanoke had successfully integrated with natives or survived independently, it would undermine the company's narrative that English settlers needed massive support and investment. The truth was bad for business, so it was erased. Let's return to Powhatan's alleged confession to John Smith. Modern historians have re-examined this account with fresh eyes, and they've noticed something. Powhatan's description of where he killed the colonists matches the location of Site X, the hidden symbol on John White's map. Powhatan described a settlement at Chesapeake, near where the river makes a great bend. Site X is located at exactly such a location. Archaeological evidence confirms English presence there at the right time period. So was Powhatan telling the truth? And if he massacred colonists at Site X, what happened to the ones at Croatoan? Recent analysis suggests a heartbreaking possibility. Powhatan may have attacked Site X precisely because the colonists had split up. The inland group was isolated and vulnerable. Powhatan's warriors could strike them without interference from the larger group at Croatoan. This would explain why he had English artifacts to show Smith. They came from Site X. But it also means that some colonists at Croatoan might have survived the massacre, only to die in other ways. This theory is gaining traction because it accounts for both the artifacts and the lack of survivors. The colony didn't meet one fate. It met several. Here's a possibility that's both beautiful and tragic: complete cultural absorption. What if the Roanoke colonists who survived, whether at Croatoan, Site X, or scattered elsewhere, made a conscious choice to become Native American? What if they didn't just integrate, they transformed? Their children would have been raised in Native culture, speaking Native languages, following Native spiritual practices. Within 2 generations, the English identity would have been completely absorbed. The grandchildren of Eleanor Dare wouldn't have thought of themselves as English at all. They would have been Croatoan, or Lumbee, or Chesapeake. This isn't speculation. This is exactly what happened to countless European captives and adoptees throughout colonial history. The wilderness transformed them. But here's what makes this theory compelling for Roanoke. It explains why no one ever came forward to claim their English heritage when later settlers arrived. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't fear. They simply no longer identified as English. The lost colony wasn't lost. It was reborn as something entirely new. Today, The descendants of those who may have survived Roanoke live among us. They are teachers, fishermen, artists, and community leaders in North Carolina. Many carry oral traditions passed down through generations. They speak of ancestors who came from across the water and brought new ways. The Lumbee Nation, recognized by the state of North Carolina, has formally claimed connection to the Lost Colony based on surnames, oral history, and DNA evidence. But here's what's important. For these communities, this isn't a mystery to be solved. It's their family history. It's their heritage. For 400 years, academic researchers have treated Roanoke as a puzzle, a riddle, an enigma. But for the descendants, it's personal. It's about honoring ancestors who survived unimaginable hardship, who adapted, who persevered. When we ask, what happened to the Lost Colony? We're asking the wrong question. We should be asking, who are the survivors, and how do they want their story told? Because they're still here. They never left. So what really happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke? After examining all the evidence, archaeological, genetic, historical, and cultural, here's the most likely scenario. The colony split into at least 3 groups after White's departure. One group, possibly including Eleanor Dare and Virginia Dare, went to Croatoan Island with Mantio's people. They integrated peacefully but were devastated by a combination of disease, hurricanes, and resource scarcity. Most died. A few survived, and their DNA persists in modern descendants. A second group went inland to Site X. They attempted to establish a hidden settlement, but were discovered and killed by Powhatan's warriors, who saw them as a threat to his empire. Their artifacts remain, but they left no survivors. A third group's fate is unknown, possibly captured by Spanish raiders, possibly died attempting to reach Jamestown, possibly scattered so completely that their trail went cold. The word Croatoan wasn't a message to John White. It was a marker, a signpost, perhaps a decoy. The colonists were already gone when they carved it. The truth is, we're asking the wrong question when we ask what happened. The right question is, how do we honor both the tragedy and the survival? The Lost Colony of Roanoke represents something uniquely American. The collision of cultures, the cost of colonization, the resilience of human beings in the face of impossible odds, and the way truth becomes legend when we stop listening to those who remember. John White's family didn't vanish into thin air. They walked into a new world, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force, sometimes by necessity. They became something England never intended and America didn't expect. They became survivors. Their blood runs through families living today. Their DNA is carved into the genetic landscape of North Carolina. The word Croatoan wasn't a mystery. It was a farewell. It was the last English word some of them ever wrote before they became something else entirely. And perhaps that's the real story of America. Not the grand narratives of conquest and colonization, but the quiet, desperate, resilient transformations that happen when people are pushed to the edge of the world and forced to choose between identity and survival. They chose survival, and in doing so, they became immortal. But this story isn't over. Every year, new evidence emerges. In 2021, researchers discovered additional European artifacts at a site in Bertie County, North Carolina, over 100 miles from Roanoke. These artifacts suggest an even wider dispersal pattern than previously thought. In 2023, ground-penetrating radar at Site X revealed what might be a mass burial site. Excavation is pending. The DNA database grows larger every year, with more descendants coming forward to be tested. Each new piece of evidence reshapes the puzzle. And here's what's extraordinary. We may be closer to solving this mystery now than at any point in the last 400 years. Advanced forensic techniques, satellite archaeology, environmental DNA sampling, and isotope analysis are revealing details that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. Within the next decade, we may finally have definitive proof of what happened to specific individuals like Virginia Dare. The mystery that has haunted America since before America existed might finally be solved. But when it is, will we be ready for the answer? Because the truth might be more tragic than the legend. Let's speak their names. We often discuss the Lost Colony as a rigid, uniform, and tightly controlled society, but they were individuals. Eleanor Dare, daughter of the governor, mother of Virginia. Ananias Dare, her husband, a tiler and bricklayer from London. Virginia Dare, born August 18, 1587, the first English child born in America. Manteo, the Croatoan interpreter who became Lord of Roanoke. Dionys Harvey, a pregnant woman who gave birth to a child whose name we'll never know. William Wiles, John Borden, Thomas Coleman, Jane Pierce, Margaret Lawrence. These were real people with real lives, real fears, real hopes. They came to America looking for opportunity, adventure, and a new beginning. Instead, they found hardship, isolation, and an end we're still trying to understand. When we reduce them to a mystery, we rob them of their humanity. These people suffered. These people made impossible choices. These people died far from home, or transformed so completely that home became meaningless. They deserve more than to be a riddle. They deserve to be remembered as human beings who faced the unthinkable and did their best to survive. John White wasn't just a governor. He was an artist. His watercolor paintings of Native American life, coastal landscapes, and flora and fauna are some of the most important visual records of 16th century America. These paintings reveal something crucial. White respected and admired Native cultures. His images are detailed, dignified, and accurate. He painted natives as complex, fully human individuals, not as savages or curiosities. This suggests that White would have supported peaceful integration with Native peoples, which makes his choice of Manteo as liaison even more significant. White believed coexistence was possible. His colony was meant to be different from the violent, extractive Spanish model. It was meant to be a place where English and Native people could live together, trade, intermarry, and build something new. In a tragic irony, his vision may have actually succeeded, just not in the way he planned, and not in a way he ever got to witness. The colony he dreamed of may have existed for years, decades even, hidden from English eyes. His daughter may have lived to old age, speaking Croatoan, teaching her children about a grandfather who tried to come back, but never made it. The dream survived, even if the dreamer never knew. Let's imagine the last days before they left. It's summer 1588. John White has been gone nearly a year. Supplies are critically low. A child has died from disease. Tensions are rising. A scout returns with troubling news. Spanish ships have been spotted to the south. A council is called. Ananias Dare, Eleanor White's husband, argues for staying and fortifying the settlement. Others, led by Manteo, argue for dispersal, some to Croatoan, some inland, making them impossible to find and destroy as a group. The debate is heated. Families are torn. Do you stay together and risk annihilation, or split up and risk never seeing your friends again? Finally, a decision is made. 3 days to pack. Families will choose their own path, but the choices are Croatoan or inland. One man volunteers to stay behind to carve the message, Croatoan, to lead John White to the largest group. On the 4th day, at dawn, they leave. The fort stands empty for the first time in months. The man finishes his carving, takes a last look at the place that was supposed to be home, and walks into the forest. He never looks back. The fort never sees another English soul until 1590, when White finds it deserted. Eleanor Dare deserves her own chapter in this story. Imagine being pregnant in a wilderness settlement, your father leaving with promises of return, giving birth without doctors or midwives beyond the knowledge of other colonists and native women, nursing your daughter through her first year while supplies dwindle and hope fades. Did Eleanor ever resent her father for leaving? Did she understand the impossible situation he was in? Did she die still believing he would return? Or did she live long enough to accept that England had abandoned them, that her daughter would grow up as something other than English? The cruelest irony is this: Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, may have lived her entire life not speaking English, not practicing Christianity, not knowing anything about the England her mother remembered. Virginia might have married a Croatoan man, had children of her own, died an old woman surrounded by grandchildren who carried her DNA but not her name. Eleanor's legacy isn't the mystery of disappearance. It's the strength to survive the unthinkable and raise a daughter in conditions that would have broken most people. That's the real story. That's the one we should tell. Here's the frustrating truth. We may never know with absolute certainty what happened to every single colonist. The complete picture has been destroyed by time, weather, human conflict, and deliberate suppression. But uncertainty doesn't mean the story has no value. The very fact that we're still searching, still caring, still trying to piece together what happened to 117 people who died centuries ago says something profound about human nature. We need to know. We need closure. We need to believe that people don't just vanish without leaving a trace. And the beautiful, terrible truth is, they didn't vanish. They left traces everywhere. In the ground, in DNA, in oral histories, in the landscapes they walked through, in the descendants who carry their blood. We're swimming in traces. We just didn't know how to read them until recently. And now that we can, the story that's emerging is more complex, more human, and more heartbreaking than the simple mystery we thought we were solving. The lost colony wasn't lost. We were just looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions, listening to the wrong voices. Why does this story still matter? Because it's the template for everything that came after in American history. The collision of European and native cultures, the cost of colonization, the resilience of those who were displaced, the way power writes history and erases inconvenient truths. The lost colony is a microcosm of the entire American experience. When we search for what happened at Roanoke, we're really searching for the truth about ourselves, about what we're willing to do to survive, about what we're willing to sacrifice for safety, about how quickly civilized people can become something unrecognizable when pushed to the edge. The colonists who carved Croatoan weren't that different from us. They had families they loved, hopes for the future, fears they couldn't voice. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. And they did what humans have always done. They adapted, they endured, and when they couldn't endure, they transformed into something new. That's not a mystery. That's the human condition. And it's still happening today, in different forms, in different places. We're all descendants of people who survived the unsurvivable. Roanoke just makes it visible. To the descendants who may be watching this, your ancestors were extraordinary. Whether they died in the first winter or lived to old age among native communities, whether they were killed by Powhatan or drowned in a storm, whether they transformed willingly or by necessity, they survived long enough to pass on their DNA to you. That makes you living proof that the lost colony wasn't a failure. It was a transformation. Your existence is the answer to the mystery. To the historians, archaeologists, and geneticists still searching, keep looking, keep testing, keep excavating. Not because we need a neat resolution, but because these people deserve to have their stories told completely and truthfully. And to everyone else, remember that history isn't a collection of dates and battles. It's a collection of individual human experiences, most of which were never recorded, many of which were actively erased, all of which shaped the world we live in today. The Lost Colony of Roanoke teaches us that sometimes being lost is the only way to survive. And sometimes, survival looks nothing like what we expected. Croatoan. One word. 435 years of questions. But maybe we've been reading it wrong this whole time. Maybe it wasn't a message about where they went. Maybe it was a message about who they became. Croatoan wasn't a place. It was a transformation. The English colonists of Roanoke walked into the forests and shores of North Carolina and emerged, or their children emerged, as something entirely new. Not quite English. Not quite Croatoan. Something born of necessity, forged in survival, and ultimately invisible to the history books written by those who came after. That's why they're called the Lost Colony. Not because they died, but because they became unfindable. They camouflaged themselves in the landscape, in the culture, in the bloodlines of people who would never claim English heritage because they no longer felt English. Croatoan was their last word in their old language. Everything after that was written in a language John White wouldn't have understood. And maybe that was the point. Maybe they didn't want to be found. Maybe survival required becoming something England would never recognize. If so, they succeeded brilliantly. They're still here. We just forgot how to see them. Until now.